The man's friendly mask vanished. That wasn't a request. He and two others drew their revolvers, the moonlight glinting on the polished steel barrels. But before they could aim, the $2 mule, Barnaby, exploded into motion. With a speed that seemed impossible for a creature so old and frail, he charged, not at the men, but directly at the leader's horse, slamming his powerful body into its flank. The horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider. In the chaos that erupted, Barnaby became a whirlwind of hooves and teeth, moving with a brutal, calculated precision that was horrifying to behold. This wasn't the panicked flight of a frightened animal. It was the trained assault of a warrior. When the dust settled seconds later, 3 men were groaning on the ground as the others fled into the night. Jedediah stared, dumbfounded at the creature standing over them, breathing hard. He hadn't just bought a mule. He had inherited a mission, a key, and a very dangerous enemy. Nobody wanted the old mule. He stood in the far corner of the dusty livestock pen at Finch's trading post, a creature seemingly made of tired angles and faded hopes. His dun-colored coat was matted and dull, clinging to a frame so gaunt his ribs stood out like the slats of a broken-down fence. His long, sorrowful ears, which should have been sharp and alert to the desert sounds, drooped with a finality that spoke of a life not just lived, but thoroughly wrung dry. To the ranchers and hardened traders who had gathered under the relentless Arizona sun, he was less an animal and more a shadow waiting for the earth to reclaim it. But what they couldn't see, what no one in that dusty clearing could possibly guess, was that this worthless animal, a hair's breadth from the knackers, was about to make his next owner the master of a fortune that could reshape the entire territory. Jedediah Jed Stone felt the smooth, worn surfaces of his last 2 silver dollars in his palm. The coins were warm from his anxious grip, their meager weight a constant physical reminder of his cascading failures. For months, failure had been his only companion. It was in the taste of the stale water in his canteen, in the frayed canvas of his empty supply wagon, and in the haunting silence where the memory of his wife's laughter used to be. She had left for the green and civilized East, taking the children with her, her final letter a gentle but firm severance from the man he had become, a dreamer who had chased a phantom of gold into the ground and found only bedrock and bitterness. Now, the whispers of his debts followed him from one dusty settlement to the next, a more persistent shadow than his own. He'd come to the auction with the last flickering ember of hope, praying for a miracle in the form of a cheap pack animal, something, anything, strong enough to haul his gear for one final desperate foray into the unforgiving Dragoon Mountains. The auctioneer, Bartholomew Finch, a portly man whose sweat-stained shirt clung to his torso like a second skin, was in his element, his voice a booming cadence that coaxed dollars from reluctant pockets. Prime horses were sold, their powerful muscles rippling. Sturdy cattle were herded toward new owners. Then, Finch led the old mule forward. A hush fell over the small crowd, followed by a ripple of dismissive snorts. The animal, introduced with a distinct lack of enthusiasm as Barnaby, dragged his right foreleg in a pronounced, painful-looking limp. His breathing was a shallow, audible whistle, each breath a visible effort. 15 years on him if he's a day, a cattleman with a sun-cured face muttered next to Jed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. Finch ought to be paying someone to cart him off. Starting the bid for this seasoned working animal, Finch announced. The usual confidence gone from his voice, replaced by a strained, pleading tone. He mopped his brow with a grimy handkerchief. Let's say $5, a bargain for such a veteran of the trail. The silence that answered him was thick and heavy. A rancher in a fine leather vest laughed out loud. Men who had just paid $60 for a healthy mare wouldn't spare $5 for a creature that looked like it would collapse before it reached the edge of town. They turned away, their backs a unanimous and brutal verdict on the mule's value. $4 then! Finch's plea began to crack. His eyes darted nervously around the thinning crowd, not like a seller trying to make a sale, but like a man cornered. He's got good, honest work left in him. A real stalwart companion. Still nothing. The crowd was dissolving, men mounting their new purchases and riding off, leaving only a few stragglers who were more interested in the shade than the auction. Jed felt the familiar, acidic twist of despair in his gut. It was over. His last chance was evaporating with the heat. As he turned to leave, the old mule, Barnaby, lifted his heavy head. For a single, startling moment, his eyes met Jed's across the pen. What Jed saw in those deep, liquid brown orbs stopped him cold. It wasn't the dull, vacant resignation of a broken beast. It was a flicker of something profound and unexpected, a sharp, knowing intelligence, a lucidity that seemed to pierce right through Jed's dusty clothes and see the hollow man inside. It was the gaze of a fellow survivor, of one who understood what it meant to be written off by the world. $3, for the love of... Finch's voice trailed away into a pathetic whisper. He looked around the emptying pen, his expression a strange cocktail of desperation and something else Jed couldn't place. It looked almost like relief that the serious buyers were gone. Jed stepped forward. The sound of his worn boots crunching on the dry earth felt unnaturally loud. He opened his hand, revealing the 2 silver dollars gleaming in his palm. $2, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Finch's head snapped up, his jowly face a mask of shock. His eyes widened, and the relief Jed had glimpsed was now unmistakable, but it was threaded with a darker ribbon of fear. For a long second, the auctioneer hesitated, his gaze darting from Jed's outstretched hand to the mule, then back again. He seemed to be weighing something far heavier than the price of an old animal. $2? Finch repeated, his voice barely audible. He took a half-step closer. You're sure about that, son? There's no taking it back, you understand? This sale is final. The strange gravity in his tone, the sheer intensity of his warning sent a prickle of unease up Jed's spine. It was a bizarre thing to say about such a pitiful transaction, but Jed was a man standing on the last rung of the ladder, and that rung was on fire. He had nothing left to lose. I'm sure, he affirmed, extending the coins. With a hand that trembled visibly, Finch snatched the dollars and shoved them deep into his pocket with a panicked swiftness, as if the silver might burn him. He untied the frayed rope from the post and thrust it into Jed's hand, the transfer hurried and graceless. The deal was done. A piece of advice, Finch muttered, leaning in so close Jed could smell the sour sweat and cheap whiskey on his breath. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. Keep him clear of prying eyes, and for your own sake, don't let anyone get too close to examine him. That mule, he draws the wrong kind of attention. What kind of attention? Jed asked, his frown deepening. But Finch was already backing away, moving with an agility that belied his bulk. Just remember what I told you, he called back, already turning to scurry toward the relative safety of the trading post. Keep him quiet. Keep him hidden. Jed stood alone in the oppressive, shimmering heat, the coarse rope in his hand connected to Barnaby. The mule hadn't moved a muscle, watching the auctioneer's hasty retreat with that same unsettlingly intelligent gaze. Jed approached him cautiously, running a hand along his neck. The fur was coarse as he'd expected, but underneath, the muscle was like corded steel. He was thin, yes, but he was not weak. As he led Barnaby away from the trading post, Jed's confusion grew. The pronounced limp that had been so obvious in the pen began to lessen with every step. It was as if the mule was unkinking a leg he'd held in a stiff, unnatural position for hours. By the time they were a quarter mile out of town, Barnaby was walking with a steady, even, powerful gait, his breathing now deep and regular. The transformation was astonishing. Jed stopped, turning to study his new purchase in the full light of the desert sun. Away from the deceptive shadows of the pen, Barnaby looked like a different animal entirely. The patchy, matted appearance Jed now realized was a deliberate camouflage of dust and carefully applied mud. Beneath it, his true coat had a healthy, underlying luster. He wasn't a young mule, not by a long shot, but he was far from the decrepit, half-dead creature Finch had presented. This animal was in his prime. "What in blazes is your story, old boy?" Jed murmured, scratching the mule behind his long ears. Barnaby responded by turning his head and fixing him with that knowing stare, then nudged Jed's hand with his muzzle, a gesture of deliberate, quiet communication. They walked on toward Jed's camp, a miserable affair marked by the skeletal frame of his broken-down wagon. As they approached, Barnaby suddenly stopped dead, his head snapping up, his ears swiveling forward like twin antennae locking onto a signal. He let out a low, guttural snort. Jed's own senses, honed by years of solitude in the wilderness, went on high alert. He followed the mule's intense gaze to a rocky ridge about half a mile distant. 3 riders on horseback sat motionless, their dark shapes silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. They weren't travelers resting their mounts. Their posture was predatory, the stillness of hunters watching their prey. "Friends of yours?" Jed asked, his voice a low whisper. Barnaby stamped his right forehoof once on the hard-packed earth. A clear, emphatic no. The riders remained for another long minute, a silent, menacing promise before turning as one and melting back behind the ridge. An icy finger of dread traced its way down Jed's spine. They would be back. That night, the desert grew cold quickly. Jed sat by his small, sputtering campfire, the flames pushing back a circle of immense, star-filled darkness. Barnaby refused the handful of grain Jed offered. Instead, he stood at the very edge of the firelight, a silent, vigilant sentinel, his ears constantly moving, sampling the night air for sounds Jed couldn't hear. Around midnight, Jed was jolted from a light doze by a sound from Barnaby. It wasn't the ear-splitting, grating bray of a common mule. It was a deep, resonant, two-toned call that echoed with a strange, purposeful quality. It sounded less like an animal's cry and more like a signal. A moment later, from the deep darkness to the east, an answer came, the high, yipping howl of a coyote. But it was wrong. It was too precise, too practiced. It was a reply. Jed grabbed his old Winchester rifle, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "What is it, boy? What's out there?" Barnaby walked directly over to Jed's wagon and nudged the old, cracked leather harness that hung from its side. Frowning, Jed took it down. It was worthless, ready to fall apart. But as he ran his fingers over it, he felt something his initial inspection had missed. A section of a strap, near one of the brass rings, had stitching that was thicker and newer than the rest. It was expertly done, almost invisible. With his pocket knife, his fingers clumsy with a sudden sense of urgency, Jed carefully sliced the tough threads. Tucked deep inside the leather was a small pouch made of oilskin to be waterproof. Inside that was a single, tightly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it by the flickering firelight, his breath held tight in his chest. The handwriting was rushed, but the ink was dark and the words were clear. "My name is Elias Thorne. If you are reading this, then I am likely dead, murdered by Silas Vance, a man who believes this mule will lead him to the Serpent Spring. He is wrong. The mule does not know the way, but he carries the key." Jed's blood ran cold. He knew the name. Silas the Vulture Vance was a black-hearted landowner who had amassed a small empire by choking the life out of homesteads, controlling water rights, and bleeding decent folk dry through violence and intimidation. The note continued. "Look at his right forehoof. The mark is not a brand. It is a map symbol, a key. It matches carvings I left on a trail only I know, a trail that leads to the spring. Vance thinks the mule will eventually lead him there, which is why he hunts him. But only a man the mule comes to trust can follow that trail, protect him. The spring is the lifeblood of this desert. Do not let it fall into the hands of a man like Vance. He will bleed the land and its people dry." Jed slowly lowered the note, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He looked at Barnaby, who stood watching him, his intelligent eyes filled with a profound and somber understanding. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently lifted the mule's right foreleg. There, on the hard, flat surface of the hoof, was exactly what Elias had described. It wasn't the scarred, ugly burn of a branding iron. It was a series of intricate, expertly carved lines that formed the unmistakable image of a coiled serpent. It was beautiful. It was secret. It was a key. At that exact moment, the sharp clip-clop of hooves on rocky ground shattered the night's silence. They were approaching fast. Not 3 riders this time, but more, at least 5 or 6. They were done watching from a distance. Barnaby immediately moved, placing his solid body between Jed and the direction of the approaching sounds. He lowered his head, his muscles bunched, not in submission, but in preparation for battle. "Easy there, friend," a gravelly, mocking voice called from the encroaching darkness. A hulking man on a black horse rode into the edge of the firelight. His face was a road map of cruelty, a long scar pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. Jed knew instinctively this was Vance's top man. "We're not here for you. We're here for the mule. Mr. Vance has misplaced a piece of his property." "I bought him fair and square at Finch's auction," Jed said, his hand tightening on the warm wood of his Winchester. His voice was steadier than he felt. The man, Kane, let out a cold laugh. "Finch is a coward who is paid to look the other way. We'll give you $50 for your trouble," he sneered, dismounting with a predator's grace. "A generous offer considering you paid too. A quick profit for you, and no trouble." $50. It was a fortune. It was a new wagon, new supplies, a chance to start over somewhere else, far away from his failures. But he looked at Barnaby, standing his ground with a quiet, defiant courage. He looked at the note from the murdered Elias Thorne, still clutched in his hand. This was no longer about money. It was about a dead man's last wish and the fate of a spring that gave life. It was about standing for something for the first time in a long time. "I think I'll keep him," Jed said quietly. Kane's sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. That wasn't a request. He and two others drew their revolvers, the moonlight glinting on the polished steel barrels. But before they could take aim, Barnaby exploded into motion. With a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of his size, he charged, not at the men, but at Kane's horse, slamming his powerful chest and shoulders into the horse's flank. The animal shrieked in terror and reared violently, throwing its rider to the ground in a heavy, bone-jarring heap. In the instant of chaos that followed, Barnaby became a whirlwind of hooves and teeth. He moved with a brutal, calculated precision, not a panicked animal, but a combat-trained warrior executing a plan. He wasn't trying to kill. He was disabling, separating men from their mounts with surgical accuracy. Jed dove behind his wagon as a bullet whizzed past his ear, splintering the wood. When the dust and panicked shouts began to settle, seconds later, 3 of Vance's men were groaning on the ground, and the others were desperately fighting to control their spooked, terrified horses before wheeling them around and retreating into the blackness of the night. Barnaby stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his disguise of frailty shed and gone forever. In the moonlight, he looked magnificent, a powerful, intelligent, and dangerous creature. Jed stared, his mind reeling. He hadn't bought a mule. He had paid $2 for a legacy. He had inherited a secret mission, a key to an unknown future, and a very, very dangerous enemy. And his only partner in this sudden, terrifying venture was a $2 mule with the ghost of a murdered man in his eyes and the soul of a warrior in his heart. The quiet life of a failed prospector was over. A new, more perilous one had just begun. The desert night fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. The peaceful quiet of before had been replaced by a tense, ringing void, filled with the echoes of violence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jed's heart still hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the spot where Vance's men had vanished into the darkness, his knuckles white on the stock of his Winchester. He was a prospector, a man of patience and solitude, used to the slow, quiet work of pick and pan. He was not a fighter. The sudden, brutal reality of the attack left him shaken to his core, a metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He looked at Barnaby. The mule stood calmly now, his breathing even, though a tremor of lingering adrenaline ran through his powerful muscles. The moonlight caught the intelligent gleam in his eye, and Jed understood. This animal had been living with this threat for a long, long time. He was a veteran of a secret war Jed had just been conscripted into. Jed knelt and ran a hand down Barnaby's sturdy leg, his fingers tracing the impossible, intricate carving on the mule's hoof. A key. A legacy left by a murdered man. Elias Thorne. For a long moment, Jed considered his options. He could turn west, head for the nearest town, sell the mule for whatever he could get, and disappear. $50, the man had offered. Maybe he could get more now, enough to buy a ticket on a stagecoach and leave this harsh, unforgiving land behind forever. It was the sensible choice, the choice a sane man would make. But as he looked at Barnaby, standing his ground with quiet dignity, he saw not just an animal, but a responsibility. He thought of Elias Thorne, a man he'd never met, who had trusted a stranger with his life's work. To run now would be more than cowardice. It would be a betrayal. It would be an admission that the man his wife had left, the man who had given up, was all he would ever be. A new, unfamiliar fire began to burn in the hollow space in his chest. It was purpose. "All right, Elias," Jed whispered to the stars. "All right, Barnaby, we'll see this through." By the first light of dawn, they were moving. Jed packed what little he had, his hands working with a newfound urgency. He studied the note again. "It matches carvings I left on a trail only I know. A prospector knows how to read the land, how to spot an unnatural rock formation or a seam of quartz. But this was different. This was a language. He needed someone who could speak it. His mind went to a name he'd heard whispered in saloons and around campfires. Chayton. An old Chiricahua man who lived alone in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, miles from any settlement. They said he was a holdout from the old days, a man who had refused to be moved, who still lived by the ancient ways. They said he could read the history of the land in the curve of a canyon wall and predict the weather from the flight of a hawk. Some called him a mystic, others called him a stubborn old recluse. Jed figured he was their only hope. It took them 2 days of hard travel, moving cautiously and keeping to the low ground of arroyos and washes. Barnaby moved with a tireless, ground-eating stride, seeming to understand their need for secrecy, picking his way over treacherous, rocky ground with an uncanny surety. The mule was a constant source of wonder to Jed. He would stop and refuse to move, only for Jed to discover a patch of quicksand or a loose rock slide just ahead. He was more than a pack animal. He was a guide and a guardian. They found Chayton's dwelling tucked into a small hidden canyon, marked only by a thin tendril of smoke rising into the vast blue sky. It was a simple wickiup, built of bent branches and hide, with a small, well-tended garden of corn and squash nearby. As Jed approached, leading Barnaby, an old man emerged from the dwelling. He was tall and impossibly lean, his face a magnificent tapestry of wrinkles, each line telling a story. His long, silver hair was bound by a simple leather cord. His eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. They took in Jed's worn clothes, the rifle in his hand, and settled on Barnaby with an expression of profound recognition. "You have walked a dangerous path to find me," Chayton said, his voice a low rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. He did not seem surprised. "I was told you know the land better than any man alive," Jed began, feeling clumsy and out of place. "I'm following a trail, a strange one." Chayton's gaze remained fixed on Barnaby. "The trail follows you," he corrected gently. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and graceful. He did not ask permission but knelt beside the mule. Barnaby, who had shied from every other man, stood perfectly still as Chayton gently lifted his right foreleg. The old man traced the coiled serpent on the hoof with a long, weathered finger. A low sigh escaped his lips. "The serpent that sleeps below," he murmured, more to himself than to Jed. "The giver of life. My people have not seen this sign since the time of my grandfather's grandfather." He looked up at Jed, his eyes piercing. "This mark is not for a man who seeks gold. It is for a guardian. Why do you seek the spring?" Jed saw no point in lying. He told Chayton everything. The auction, the note from Elias Thorne, the attack by Vance's men, and the promise he had made to himself in the desert night. He spoke of his own failures, of his need to do one right thing in a life that had gone so wrong. When he finished, the canyon was silent save for the cry of a distant hawk. Chayton rose slowly to his feet. "Elias Thorne," he said, the name tasting of memory. "He was a man with a good heart. He came to me many seasons ago. He understood that the spring was not a treasure to be owned, but a sacred trust. He knew that the one who controls the water in this land controls the people. A man like Silas Vance would use it to create an empire of fear and thirst." He looked from Jed to Barnaby and back again. "The mule has chosen you. The spirit of the spring has chosen you. It is a heavy burden." "I know," Jed said simply. "I will help you find the trail," Chayton declared. "But know this, Vance's men are like coyotes. They are relentless, and they hunt in a pack. They will not stop." The next morning, they began the true journey. Chayton led the way, not by map, but by an intimate knowledge of the land itself. He moved through the harsh desert terrain with an ease that belied his age. He showed Jed how to read the subtle signs Elias had left behind. On the underside of a flat rock overlooking a dry wash, they found the first carving, a coiled serpent, identical to the one on Barnaby's hoof. Miles later, hidden behind the peeling bark of an ancient ironwood tree, they found another. It was a language of whispers, a secret conversation between two men, now continued by a third. Their days fell into a rhythm. Chayton would find the trail, Jed would watch their back trail, and Barnaby carried their supplies, a steadfast and silent partner. Each night by the campfire, Chayton would share stories of the land, of the sacred places, and of the serpent that sleeps below, a spirit that guarded the hidden water that gave life to the desert. Jed listened, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. He was no longer just a failed prospector. He was a link in a chain, a keeper of a promise. Their fourth day on the trail, danger found them. They were navigating a narrow, winding gulch when Barnaby suddenly froze, his ears swiveling. Chayton held up a hand, and they pressed themselves into a deep fissure in the canyon wall, pulling Barnaby in with them. The space was tight, the smell of rock dust and damp earth filling Jed's nostrils. Moments later, they heard the sound of approaching horses. 4 of Vance's men rode into the gulch, their voices echoing off the rock walls. It was Kane, the cruel-faced leader from the first attack, and his crew. "He's got the old Apache with him now," one of the riders grumbled. "They say he can talk to the wind. How are we supposed to track a ghost?" "He's no ghost." Kane's voice was a cold snarl. "He's a man, and he bleeds like any other. Vance wants that spring. He wants the deed, the claim, everything, and he wants that mule. Find their tracks. They can't have just disappeared. Jed held his breath, his hand resting on Barnaby's muzzle to keep him quiet. The riders passed less than 20 yards from their hiding place. Jed could see the grime on their clothes, the cruel set of their jaws. The raw, naked threat was so close it was a physical presence. After what felt like an eternity, the riders moved on, their voices fading down the canyon. Only when Chayton gave a slow nod did they emerge, their hearts pounding. The chase was no longer an abstract threat, it was breathing down their necks. 2 days later, following a series of markings that led them high into a cluster of rocky mesas, Chayton stopped. "We are here," he said quietly. This was his last camp. It was a perfectly hidden spot, a wide ledge sheltered by a massive rock overhang, invisible from below and above. There were signs of a long abandoned camp, the charred stones of a fire pit, a discarded tin cup. It felt like a sacred place, a final bastion. Chester, a character from another tale, was not present, but Barnaby seemed to sense the history, standing quietly and respectfully. Chayton pointed to the back wall of the shelter. Elias was a clever man. He knew they would find this place one day. At the base of the wall, a large, flat stone was set into the earth. It looked natural, but when Jed and Chayton put their shoulders to it, it pivoted inward, revealing a small, dry cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a leather-bound journal and a rolled-up piece of parchment. It was a proper map. Jed unrolled it with trembling hands. It was exquisitely detailed, showing the surrounding territory with a surveyor's precision. But it showed more than just the location of Serpent Spring. It laid out a plan. Elias had marked out not just the spring, but the entire basin it was in. A natural fortress, defensible from all sides. He had noted areas for farming, for grazing. He had even sketched out a small, logically placed settlement. Jed opened the journal. The final entry, dated months ago, was chilling. "They have found me. Kane is closing in. I have led them on a false trail to buy time, but it will not last. I will not let the spring fall into Vance's hands. I have hidden this map. Barnaby is the key to the trail that leads here. If someone with a good heart finds him, my work can be completed. This land does not need another tyrant. It needs a community. It needs a place of hope." Jed looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting Chayton's. The full weight of Elias Thorne's vision settled upon him. This wasn't just about finding water. It was about building a future. It was about creating the very thing Jed had lost. A home, a community built on fairness, not fear. For the first time, he saw the full scope of what they were fighting for. It was a treasure far greater than gold. A surge of triumph and purpose washed over him. They had the final piece of the puzzle. They had the map. They could... A sharp glint of light from a far-off ridge caught Jed's eye. He squinted, his blood running cold. It was the reflection of sunlight off a spyglass. On the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was a line of horsemen. At least 10 of them. They weren't moving. They were watching. Kane and his entire hunting party, their hiding place, their sanctuary had been discovered. The trail of whispers had come to an end, and a storm of violence was about to break. The glint of the spyglass from the distant ridge was like the cold touch of a gun barrel to the back of Jed's neck. There was no more running, no more hiding. The whispers of the trail had led them here, to this final exposed ledge, and their enemies had followed. Jed could count them now, a full dozen riders, a small army against 2 men and a mule. The sheer weight of their numbers felt like a physical pressure, threatening to crush the fragile hope that had just begun to bloom in his chest. His first instinct was the familiar gut-wrenching urge to flee, to find some deeper hole to crawl into. But then he looked at Chayton. The old Chiricahua man stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the distant horseman, his expression not of fear, but of profound, analytical calm. He looked at the map in Jed's hand, then at the surrounding mesas, his mind working with a speed and clarity that was awe-inspiring. "They believe they have us trapped," Chayton said, his voice low and steady. "They are arrogant. Their leader Vance has let his greed make him impatient. He has brought all his wolves for the final kill. This is a mistake. A patient hunter starves the wolf. An impatient one feeds him." "They'll be on us in an hour, Chayton," Jed said, his own voice tight with tension. "We can't outrun them, and we can't fight them." "We will not do either," Chayton replied, tapping a long finger on a specific point on Elias's map. He pointed south toward a deep, narrow slit in the landscape. "We will lead them, there, into what my people call the Stone Jaw. It is a box canyon. It winds for half a mile and ends in a sheer wall of rock. There is only one way in and one way out. Jed's eyes followed his finger. They'll follow us right in, he said, a spark of understanding igniting. And then what? We'll be trapped with them. You and Barnaby will be the bait, Chayton explained, his dark eyes locking onto Jed's. You will lead them into the canyon. I will not be with you. I will take the high path along the rim. At the canyon's mouth, the rock is unstable. Elias noted it here. He pointed to a small annotation on the map. Loose shale, unstable overhang. For many seasons, a great rock has been balanced there, waiting for the right encouragement to fall. It will take all of my strength, but I can send it down. It will seal the mouth of the canyon. The sheer, audacious simplicity of the plan was breathtaking. It was a trap forged from the land itself, a plan built on knowledge and courage, not brute force. It was also incredibly dangerous. If the timing was off by a second, Jed and Barnaby would be caught in a death trap with a dozen furious armed men. How will you know when? Jed asked, his throat dry. The mule will tell me, Chayton said with absolute certainty. When you reach the end of the canyon, when there is nowhere left to run, Barnaby will give the signal, the one he gave in the desert night. I will be listening. There was no more time for talk. With a shared nod of grim understanding, they split up. Chayton, moving with the silent agility of a mountain cat, disappeared into a series of hidden handholds that led up the cliff face. Jed swung himself onto Barnaby's back. The mule stood ready, his muscles coiled like a spring. He seemed to understand everything. All right, old friend, Jed whispered, leaning forward and gripping the coarse mane. Let's give them a run to remember. He urged Barnaby forward, breaking from the cover of the ledge and heading directly for the entrance to the box canyon. As expected, a chorus of triumphant shouts rose from the distant ridge. The hunt was on. The thunder of hooves began to roll across the desert floor, a sound that grew louder and more menacing with every passing moment. Jed didn't dare look back. He focused on the narrow opening of the stone jaw ahead, his heart pounding in rhythm with Barnaby's powerful strides. They plunged into the canyon. The walls rose up on either side, steep and claustrophobic, the strip of sky above a narrow, brilliant blue ribbon. The temperature dropped, the air still and heavy. The sound of their pursuit was amplified now, echoing off the rock walls, making it sound as if they were surrounded. A bullet whined past Jed's ear, smacking into the canyon wall ahead of them with a sharp crack and a puff of stone dust. They were closing. Jed could hear the guttural voice of Cain yelling orders, and another, deeper voice, filled with rage and impatience. It had to be Silas Vance himself, come to personally oversee the capture of his prize. His presence made the pursuit even more ferocious. The posse rode with a reckless abandon, their greed for the spring and their fury at being led on such a long chase overriding their caution. Barnaby was magnificent. He navigated the treacherous, rock-strewn floor of the canyon with an intelligence that was almost human, his hooves striking the ground with unerring accuracy. He dodged boulders, leaped over fallen scree, and never broke his powerful, panicked-looking stride. He was playing his part perfectly. Jed clung to his back, the wind whipping past his face, the world a blur of red rock and desperate hope. He trusted the mule completely. His life was in Barnaby's hooves. The canyon twisted and turned. Another shot ricocheted nearby. They were getting closer. Jed could feel the end approaching, the sheer back wall of the box canyon looming ahead. It was a dead end, a wall of solid rock, a place of no escape. This was it, the moment of truth. He pulled Barnaby to a halt, wheeling him around to face their pursuers. For a heart-stopping second, he felt a wave of pure terror. What if Chayton hadn't made it? What if he'd slipped? What if the rock wouldn't move? The riders, led by Vance and Cain, stormed around the final bend, pulling their horses to a skidding, chaotic stop as they saw their quarry cornered. Their faces were masks of triumphant cruelty. "Nowhere left to run, old man," Vance bellowed, his face flushed with victory. He was a thick, imposing man with eyes as cold and dead as river stones. "The mule, the spring, it's all mine." Jed locked eyes with the man who had murdered Elias Thorne. He felt no fear, only a cold, hard resolve. He looked at Barnaby. The mule stood his ground, head held high. Then he lifted his head toward the sky and let out the signal, not a panicked bray, but that same deep, resonant, two-toned call that had echoed in the desert night. It filled the canyon, a sound of pure, ringing defiance. For a terrifying instant, nothing happened. Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that all you've got? A dying animal's cry?" Then came the rumble. It started low, a deep vibration in the soles of Jed's boots. It grew quickly to a deafening roar. High above them, at the mouth of the canyon, the world seemed to come apart. The great balanced rock, the size of a small cabin, tilted, hesitated, and then plunged downward, bringing a cascade of shale and smaller boulders with it. It hit the canyon floor with an earth-shattering impact that shook the very foundations of the mountain. A massive cloud of dust erupted, choking the canyon, sealing the entrance in a tomb of solid rock. When the dust began to settle, a new, profound silence reigned. On one side of the rockfall stood Jed and Barnaby, free. On the other, trapped in the stone jaw they had so eagerly entered, were Silas Vance and his entire posse. Their horses whinnied nervously, their faces pale with shock and dawning horror. They were alive, but they were prisoners of the very land they had sought to conquer. Jed walked Barnaby slowly toward the massive barrier of rock. He could see Vance on the other side, his face contorted in a mask of apoplectic fury. "You'll pay for this, Stone," Vance screamed, his voice hoarse. "When I get out of here, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "You're not getting out, Vance," Jed called back, his voice calm and clear, echoing in the quiet canyon. "The water, the land, it doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to any one man. It belongs to the future. It belongs to anyone with enough hope to build a life here. That was Elias Thorne's legacy. And now, it's mine to protect." He left them there, screaming their impotent threats. He knew the local sheriff, a decent man, would eventually be notified and would deal with Vance and his gang of trapped thugs. Their reign of terror was over. As Jed and Barnaby emerged from the canyon, Chayton was waiting for them, his face impassive, but a deep light of approval in his eyes. 1 year later, the settlement of Stone's Hope was no longer just a dream sketched on an old map. It was a thriving reality. Jedediah Stone, with Chayton as his counsel, had filed a legal claim for the spring and the surrounding basin, not in his name alone, but in trust for the new community. He used the knowledge from Elias's journal to establish a charter ensuring fair and equal water rights for every family who came to settle. They came, first a trickle, then a steady stream. Families tired of the tyranny of men like Vance, dreamers looking for a fresh start, people drawn by the promise of a town built not on greed, but on the principle of a shared future. Houses were built, fields were planted, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the basin where Elias Thorne had once camped alone. Jed was their founder, their leader, but he owned no more than anyone else. His wealth was not in his pocket, but in the grateful and respectful faces of his neighbors. He had, at last, done one right thing. And through it all, Barnaby remained. He was no longer the tired, decrepit creature from the auction pen. His coat was sleek and healthy, his muscles strong. He wandered the town as he pleased, a privileged and beloved citizen. The children would bring him apples, and the men would tip their hats as he passed. He spent most of his days grazing peacefully in a lush mountain meadow overlooking the town, his long ears twitching, always listening, always watchful. He was a living legend, the $2 mule who had carried the key to it all, a quiet, constant reminder that sometimes the greatest fortunes don't glitter, and that the most profound legacies often begin with a simple act of kindness to a creature nobody else wanted. The story of Jed and Barnaby is a powerful reminder that true worth is rarely visible on the surface. In our own lives, how often do we overlook incredible potential in people, in ideas, in opportunities, simply because it isn't packaged perfectly? Barnaby, the $2 mule, teaches us to look past the worn-out exterior to see the heart and courage within. This tale also speaks to the power of a second act. Jed was a man who had lost everything, defined by his failures. Yet one small leap of faith, one act of compassion for a creature everyone else had dismissed, set him on a path to redemption. It shows us that our past doesn't have to be a life sentence. We always have the choice to stand for something bigger than ourselves. Ultimately, the story's greatest lesson is about the nature of true wealth. Vance sought to own and control, but Jed learned to build and to share. The real treasure wasn't the spring itself, but the community it could sustain. A legacy of hope, not a hoard of gold. And so, the quiet courage of one man and his loyal mule reshaped an entire territory, proving that the greatest destinies often begin with the humblest of choices. If this story of hope, grit, and unexpected friendship touched your heart, then please help us share it. Hit that like button below, share this video with someone who appreciates a timeless tale of the Old West, and be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another adventure. We'd love to read your thoughts, so leave a comment below. What's the most valuable $2 mule you've ever encountered in your own life? Every bit of your support helps this channel grow and allows us to keep bringing these stories of courage and character to you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep your eyes open for the treasures hidden in plain sight.